Yep. Good morning, everyone. So, last session we learnt about the basic differences between function and class components. So, we learnt about all the techniques in class components also different from function. Right? So, how to handle APIs, forms. Now, next important, one more extra you need to know here is component life cycle hooks. This is another important thing you need to know. Actually, component hooks are different, life cycle hooks are different. Both are different concept. What is component life cycle hook? How this works? Means what is the key point about this? Actually, every component have several phases from the time it is created to the time it is destroyed. It has some phases. So that means whenever you request any component, there will be several phases for that. So to understand the component life cycle, we will first understand the basic flow of application. Actually, three important points you should know here. First, I will give you the architecture here. So in the first architecture, we need to understand how the flow works, how React application works. In that, how component is going to work, we will see that. Actually, first, when a client makes a request, so this is the client. Actually, this client is the user. So we have the user or the client. Now we have a React application. We have the React application. This is our React application. So the React application. In this React application, we have some components like home, login, like register. Such components are present. Now, first we will see the high level design, how the React works. What are the components available in our React application? And when to show the component, this is decided by one table. In our React project, a table is maintained. In our React application, we have one table. This is called, we call this table as, this table is known as route table. We are going to build this table in our next concept. Every application have a route table. Route table contains information about what are the components available and how we can request them. That means Usually route table contains two details. Means it has lot of details. Major, every route table usually have a path and it have a component. That means the path is slash login, then it is going to which component? Login. Slash register, it is going to get the register component. Register component. Slash home, it is going to get the home component. So this is called route table. That means route table contains information about what are the components that an application can serve to the client. What components are accessible? Remember, some components may be internally working, but they are not given access directly. Directly, we can't access, but we can see them in other components. For example, we have navbar, we have grid. You remembered we created custom components, our own components. Navbar grids, we don't directly access them. We access them and use them in another component. So every component designed in your React app is not requested. Only few components are requested, other components will internally work. So what are the components which can be requested by client? That information is present in a route table. Now what happens is client will make a request here. Generally, client request will be http://localhost and colon 3000 slash login. That is how the client request will be. We will design such navigation in the next session. We will learn about that. Usually, client makes a request like this. When client makes a request from a browser, this request will come to a web server. This request will come to a web server. We call this web server as a web server or HTTP server. Web server is also called as HTTP server. Actually, this flow is very common in all front-end applications in the current generation. Not only your React, Angular, Vue, React, front-end technologies are following this mechanism. Even Angular apps also have a route table. Vue apps also have a route table. That means the new navigation mechanism used for applications is routing. You will understand about that routing in the next class. We will learn about that. So when client makes a request, the request will come to this HTTP server. That request made by client is actually processed by, that request is processed by, in the web server, the request is managed. In the web server, we have a HTTP. In the web server, we have HTTP processing pipeline. In the web server, we usually have a HTTP processing pipeline. Every web application have to use web server. Actually, web servers are so many types. Later, we will learn at the end of React, we will learn deployment. Deployment, how to deploy our apps in cloud, how to deploy locally, There you will understand about how to manage these servers. That means we have two types of servers, local server and cloud. Local servers we use for developing and testing. And even these days, cloud servers are used for developing and testing. Finally, once we developed everything, we host on cloud so that it can be viewed by everyone. So general, these web servers have a processing pipeline. Whenever you make a request, your request will be processed in the processing pipeline. In this processing pipeline, you will have a HTTP handler. Generally, we have a HTTP handler. What is the job of this HTTP handler is managing request and response. That means in web application, the request and response are managed by this handler. What this handler is going to do is, this handler is going to make use of a engine. We call it as a routing engine. It is going to make use of a routing engine. With the help of this routing engine, this handler is going to verify whether the requested path is available in the route table or not. That means client will make a request. The request will come to web server. In the web server, we have a handler. This handler is responsible for verifying whether the requested path is available in the tab or not from by with the help of routing engine, where it will verify whether the requested path is available or not in the route table. And if the requested path is not available, this route table will return some status codes 200 OK, 404. That means what? Not found, like that. That means the routing engine will verify whether that login is available or not. If that login is available, now what happens? If that path is available, then this is going to load the login component. It is going to load the login component. It is going to load that login component. And once the login component is loaded, now it is going to send the login as response. That means it will send the response back to the handler. This handler will send the response back to the client. This is the basic process. Remember, this is just outline. This is the outline process, how it works. So this is the first level flow of React application. I will upload this into the class, this structure diagram here. So client will make a request and the request will come to web server. In the web server, the request is processed in handler. And in the handler, we have a routing engine. And routing engine will verify whether the requested path is available or not. It verifies from route table. And if it is available, it will load the component. And after that, it will send that as a response. This is the high level flow, how it is going to work. Now, let's save this. I will save this here. Okay. Request flow 1. Okay. Request flow 1. It's the font. Fine. This is the first level process, how it works. Okay. Now, component works in our app. That means login component is requested. How it is going to work in our app? Let's see. That means here, what will happen? Somebody requested it. How React app is going to load it? What is the background process? How it is going to work? Let's see. So the second one is client is requesting this app. So HTTP :/ localhost 3000 and / what login. So this is for a request for component. So they are requesting a component. This is the request for component, and that request is coming from a browser. That means this request usually made from a browser. Say from a browser, that request is made. From any browser, usually that request is made. Now, when the request is made from the browser, what happens is this browser is going to execute a method. Browser is going to execute a method called, it will execute a method called DOM content loaded. It will execute a method called DOM content loaded. DOM content loaded is a method. Remember, these all flow and architectural concepts are for experienced people in interviews. Because when you are attending interview in React as an experienced person, majority questions will be related to architecture, not related to concept. Because concept everybody knows. That means everyone knows what is the React concepts. Everyone knows what conceptual questions are asked in interviews. And interviewer don't have any scope to ask other than that. That means we have a fixed set of questions and we know that he will ask them. And everybody gets prepared with that. For fresher, it's okay. But for experienced people, lot of questions are asked related to architectural concepts. That means for a fresher, they will ask what it is. And for experience, they will ask how it works. That means for a fresher, they will ask what are component lifecycle methods. And for experienced people ask how the component lifecycle works. What is the architecture behind that? So all these days, you might have learned HTML. But do you know how browser loads a HTML page? Actually, how any web page is loaded in browser? You tell me how a web page is loaded in browser generally. In browser, we have a address bar. Am I right? In address bar, we will type http some site.com/page dot what HTML. After typing, what you will do? After typing, what you will do? You type http that site.com page.html. After typing, what you do? You hit enter. That means when you enter, there might be some event working. Click event, enter event. Enter is a event. One event is working. And what is that event? Name. On that event, it is loading your page. And what is that event which is loading a page? So browser loads any HTML page using a event called DOM content loaded. That is the event used to load any HTML page. For example, I will show you. So what happens is, do you have any HTML page? So let's see any HTML page. Suppose we are having some HTML page. So I'm having some HTML page here, demo HTML or something. I will put some HTML page. So welcome, something like this. Let's run this and see. Usually, so this is the page loaded. Right click, inspect, and in the inspect, go to the network category, network. So where is that network? Huh. In this network category, this is network. Okay. Now, after you open this network category, let's refresh the page. That means I am reloading the page. That means this page loaded. The page is demo.html. The page is loaded and see on which content. DOM content loaded is the event. On this event, it loaded this page. And for that, it took this much time. That means, and for that, it loaded this much resources. So this is the event for every HTML page. Every web page opens in browser on an event called DOM content loaded. That is the event that fires up when you type any website address and hit enter. Every page loads on that event. Okay. Now, when you make a request here on this DOM content loaded event, which page is going to come first? On the DOM content loaded event in your React application starts with which page? React application starts with which page? It starts with index.html. Index.html, that is the startup page. Because you are building a React application, what is the startup page? Index.html is the startup page. That means when you make a request, so first index.html will come. So login and register, they are components in index.html. Every React application starts with index.html. Already we know that in index.html, we have a div with an ID called root. Into that, our components will render. Already I showed you in the beginning when we learned about manually designing the page. I showed you how to create a page, add React into that. So when you make a request, first index.html will come. And remember, in index.html, we have in this index.html, we have a div with an ID called as what? Root. Actually, we have a div with ID called root. Do you know what happens is first this index.html, that means you requested it. Then first what happens is it will load that page. It is going to load this index.html page. It is going to load that index.html page. It will load index.html page. But it will load, actually, it will load the static DOM. It will load the static DOM. It is going to load the static DOM. Static DOM means, that means it will load the DOM structure without any functionality. That means div is loaded, but there is no work. It is not going to do any functionality. Static DOM is the DOM which is just a presentation. Buttons are loaded, text box are loaded, form is loaded, but they don't work. Only whenever you request, even JavaScript also. For example, you are designing a HTML page. In that HTML page, you added a JavaScript file. First, which one will execute? First, HTML will execute. After HTML executed, in HTML, the JavaScript will load. That means first HTML will load, then it will load the JavaScript CSS that are linked to it. That means first HTML loads. Remember, when HTML loads, that is called static DOM. That means a DOM structure is loaded, but it doesn't have any functionality. It is not having any functionality. Okay. After that, what happens is this index.html, this index.html is actually having, this index.html is having, this index.html is having the code. The code is coming from index.js. Index.js is loaded. After index.html is loaded, index.js is loaded. You know, every React application have index.js. Where is this index.js? Index.js is present in SRC. Where is index? It is in public. So first index will load. After that, it will render the static DOM. After rendering the static DOM, it will check what are the CSS and JavaScript required. And it will find that index.html needs index.js. It is going to load this index.js. Do you know what this index.js will do? This index.js is going to tell me what is linked in this index.js. In index.js, what is present? The React library, the component library, everything is present inside this index.js. That means what index.js will do is first, remember, first it is going to load, it loads React core library. It is going to load the React core library. After that, it is going to load the React DOM library. You know, for React, you need two libraries. What are those two libraries? React core library and React virtual DOM library. It will load these two libraries. After loading these two libraries, it loads component library. Component library. Component library means what? Component library means home component, login component. They are all designed by using JSX. You know, all they are linked in the page. Which component you are going to use, that component is imported in the index. It will load the component library. Not only that, after that, it loads the third party libraries if it is having any. You know, third party libraries are also linked to components. It will load the third party libraries. That means it is going to load all the libraries. Whatever libraries are required, those all libraries are loaded. After loading the library, what happens is it is going to create, that means after loading the library, now in the next step, what happens is component component object is created. Component object is created. Remember, this is in terms of class component. Generally, class component, we designed a class component called login. Login is a class. How you can access a class in any location? How you can access any class in another location? You cannot directly access the class. You have to create an object for the class. Through that object, you can access the class and its members. How we can access the classes? By using an object. That means now a component object is created. A component object is created. Remember, actually, this in the libraries, we have one more library. I haven't mentioned that, but generally it is not required. But you should know that another library is important because all this is managed by Babel library. Babel library is loaded. Who is Babel? Babel is the compiler for React. Am I right? All these libraries cannot be compiled without Babel. Babel is the compiler. Already when we created a React app in the beginning, we imported three libraries: React library, React DOM library, another Babel. Babel is what? Compiler. So now the component object is created. After the component object is created, what happens is this component is actually, okay, after creating the component object, what happens is this component object is rendered in index.html. That means component is rendered in index.html. Index.html. Component is rendered in index.html. It is rendered in index.html. That is the next phase. After the component is created, the component is rendered in index.html. And do you know what happens in this index.html actually? This index.html, usually this index.html component is generated in index.html means it is going to generate and update everything in virtual DOM. Virtual DOM. This component will be updated in virtual DOM, because you know that React cannot work directly on actual DOM. It is updated in the virtual DOM. After it is updated in the virtual DOM, this DOM is updated to the main DOM. That virtual DOM is updated to the main DOM. Now this will become from static DOM to dynamic DOM. This will become from static DOM to dynamic DOM. Dynamic DOM. Dynamic DOM means now the DOM with interactions. Static DOM means the DOM without interactions. That means the DOM with interactions. That is called as dynamic DOM. That means first it is static DOM. First it loads a plain HTML. After that, it loads all the libraries required. After that, it creates a component object, and that component object is rendered in the virtual DOM. Whenever you request a component, this is what happens in the background. And the process of converting a static DOM into dynamic DOM, it will take some time. That means you requested a page, React application. It will open a component for you. But in the background, first it is static. After that, it becomes dynamic. If any library is missing in loading, any third party is missing in the loading, then the component fails to work, right? And the process of converting static DOM to dynamic DOM, this process is called as bootstrapping. This process is called bootstrapping. In many interviews of experienced people, they ask, what is bootstrapping? Usually freshers think that it is bootstrap, right? It is not bootstrap, it is bootstrapping. It is a different mechanism. Bootstrap is different, bootstrapping is different. Bootstrapping is a very common mechanism in web applications. Every web application in the world have to convert from a static DOM to dynamic. And the process of converting static to dynamic is called bootstrap. And every web application have different phases in bootstrapping. Not like React every time, because React is having these libraries. Every web application don't have them. They have different. But every web application have to undergo the process called bootstrap. So bootstrap is different, bootstrapping is different. So what is bootstrapping? So it is the process of converting a static DOM into dynamic. That is important point here. So bootstrapping is the process of converting static DOM into dynamic DOM. That is the basic process, how it is going to work. This is the second level. First level, you saw outline flow. That means client will make a request will come to web server will use a routing engine, it will verify whether the requested component available or not, and it will load. How it loads, that's what the process. That means it loads in this way. Whenever you request, index will load, index.js, index.js will load all the libraries that you included there. After loading the libraries, it creates component and it will render the component to the page. Now, in the component creation, what are the phases? This is again another level is there. In this component creation, what are the phases? That means component is created and it is rendered. Between creation and rendering, what are the phases? How it is created, how it is rendered. That is another key point here. Let's see how it works. I will save this and request flow 2. Okay. This is the second approach. Okay. So now you understood that whenever we request a component, so the first stage is component is created. So you requested a component here. Let's put the component. So you requested a component http://localhost 3000/some login. So a component is requested. Component is requested. You requested a component. When a component is requested, what happens in the stages? When a component is requested, first, what will happen in the first level? When the component is requested, in the first level, what happens is component is created. That means first component is created. Component object is created. Component object is created. Tell me who is responsible for creating component object? Huh? Who is responsible for creating an object for that component? That is the first phase. Who is responsible for creating an object for component? Constructor. Constructor, na? What is the job of constructor? Creating an object for the class. That means who creates an component object? Constructor. Class constructor is responsible for that. What is the job of a constructor? Instantiation. Instantiation is creating object for that particular class. So whenever you request a class component, first the component object is created, and that is done by constructor. Now tell me, what are the activities that happens in component creation phase? You saw component how to create, class component how to create, and in few days from yesterday, day before yesterday, and all these few days, you saw what we done in constructor. Tell me what we done in constructor. In constructor of a class component, what we done? What are the activities performed in the constructor? You written class component, na? At least see that syntax and tell me. In a class component, we created class component, right? In the class component, you written a constructor, na? What are the activities you done in that constructor? Huh? State is configured. Where you configure the state? Inside the constructor. Good. Next. What else you done? What else you done? Only state. Huh? One more thing you have done. Event binding. Event binding also we done in constructor. Am I right? Set state can we do in constructor? Set state we cannot do in constructor. Only initializing state we can do in constructor. So when a component object is created, first phase of component is object creation, means creating an object for component. What happens in this phase? In this phase, what happens is, first, this constructor is going to construct a component class. While creating component class, do you know what it does? First, it is not having a component behavior. It gets the component behavior from react.component. That means what is the first thing it will do? It inherits. What it inherits? It inherits react dot what? Component, or react dot what? Pure component. That is the first stage. Whenever a component is created, what is the first thing happens is it gets the component behavior. How it gets the component behavior? First, it inherits these two, either React component or React comp. After that, next important is, after inheriting, you have two internal things happening in this. You remembered what are the two internal things happened is, actually state is initialized. State is initialized. Not only state, you remembered yesterday we learned properties. properties also initialize. Properties also initialize. That means properties are adapted. Automatically, every component have two basic things internally. What are those? State and properties. We don't need to create them. Automatically, these two will come whenever they inherit a component. So whenever a component is created, it is ready with state and it is ready with properties. It is ready with the state and properties. That is the first important thing. What else we do in this constructor? In the constructor, so events are registered. Events are registered. Events are registered to bind with the current class. Events are registered to bind with current class. If you don't register events to bind with current class, those events cannot use state. They cannot use state. So whenever a component is created, in that these are the activities performed. Anything else we done? Anything else we done in the constructor of class? We can do lot of other things, but they are not recommended to do. That means we can call a method which executes some functionalities. So, but if it is a method related to handling set state, it is not recommended. It will work, but it is not recommended. So, what are the valid actions to perform at the time of creating construct? Means creating an object. So, the first stage is object creation. Okay. Next important. So, this is the first phase, phase one. You requested a component, first a component is created. When component is created, it will initialize the state and it will initialize the properties and it will perform registering of events to bind with the state. That is the thing it will do. Okay, next important. After this, what is the next phase? After the component is created, the next phase is actually after component is created, the next phase comes is mount phase. The next phase comes is the mount phase. This is the next phase. Actually, this is a mount phase. Mount phase. Actually, this is just mount. After the component is defined, this is the mount phase we are having. That is the mount phase we are having. Now, tell me, who is responsible for managing the mount? Who is responsible for creating component? Constructor. Who is responsible for managing mount? Two methods, na? One is component will mount. Component will mount. Another one is component did mount. Will mount and did mount. Will mount is before mounting and did mount after mounting. These two are the methods which will manage the mounting phase. Okay, now tell me in this mounting phase, what are the activities performed? In the mounting phase, what are the activities performed? What are the activities performed in the mounting phase? What are the actions performed in this mounting phase? When component mounts, what are the actions performed is, first important is actually the events are subscribed. Events are subscribed. Remember, don't think that mount means only what we write in mount method. Mount means at the time of loading the component. Internally mount will happen. Even you don't write mount, by default, every component have a mount phase inside. What happens if already there is a mount phase? Why you are writing again mount phase? Already there is a mount phase. Then why you are writing mount phase? Because we want some additional work to perform. Right? That means don't think that if you don't write a mount phase, component will not have a mount phase. That means you may think like, if I don't write use effect, component will not mount. If you don't write use effect, component will not mount. It will mount. That means then why you are writing use effect? Because at the mounting time, you want some additional actions. That means every component without mount, how it will work? It has to mount. Internally, mount is maintained. Now, the question is, internally, what this mount will do? Externally, in mount, what we do? We call some API methods, we connect to some APIs, all such things. But internally, what a mount phase will do? Internally, mount phase is going to subscribe the events. Subscribing the events means what? I told you, event is a subscriber, sender subscriber. That means on click, it has to use a method called handle click. That means on click is connected with handle click. That is called subscribing. That is called subscribing. That means when events are subscribed to their methods, then only they can execute. They can execute. First, events are subscribed. After that, next important is memory is allocated for component. Memory is allocated for component. Actually, this is the first one. Memory is allocated for component. After that, events are subscribed. Can you tell me what is this memory called? The memory allocated for a component. And this memory can be used. This memory can be used by the components which run inside this component. Then what is this memory called as? A memory is allocated. This memory will be used by the components which can run inside this component. Then what is this memory called as? The memory of a component which is accessible to the components that run inside. It is called as which memory? Context memory. That is the context memory. We learned context. Na? Now, many times people ask like, sir, what about use context? We don't have hooks in class. That means there is no context memory in class. No, there is a context memory in class. There is a context memory in class that is internally managed. Now, in function, there is no context memory. We have to explicitly create. But in classes, the context memory is internally configured. The memory context is internally configured, state is internally configured, properties are internally configured. In function components, what we have to do, everything we have to manage explicitly. How you configure properties by using parameters, how you configure state by using use state, how you configure context by using use context. These are all internally available for class. That means class will allocate the memory. It is the context memory. Another important is it will so assign values to state, assign values to state, or you can simply say that set state. Am I right? Set state will work. Already we saw the error. Na? It says that you cannot set state into a component which is not yet mounted. That means set state will work on mount. So memory is allocated, context memory is configured, values are assigned. You can set the state into that. Events are subscribed. All the events are subscribed. This happens in the mount phase. Remember, after this happens, after the mount happens, then it will undergo render phase. After the mount happens, the render phase will work. Means actually render will work. What is rendering? Rendering is nothing but the initial output. That means this output, what is rendering? Rendering is nothing but the output is sent to the client. Output is sent to the client. That means initially whatever output is there, it is sent to the client. So when you request a component, first component is created. After that, the component will mount. After mounting, it will render. It will render the component. That means button is rendered, drop down is rendered, checkbox is rendered. Now, what client will do? Client will do some modification. He will enter some value in text box. He will click some button. Then what happens is after the mount phase, the next phase is after the mount phase, one is rendered. After rendering, if any modification happened in that particular component, that means any button is clicked, drop down is changed like that. Then what happens is another phase works, and that phase is actually update phase will work. That means we have a mount phase and we have an update phase. Now, actually, this update is managed by the events. What are the events that manage update? So that is component. Component will update. Component will update. We have like component what did update. But remember, some methods are outdated. We don't use them anymore. But earlier we used to have. I will show you what are the methods outdated. But still, we have these methods. Component will update and component did update. Now the point is, tell me what happens in this update phase. Actually, what happens in the mount phase? You know, in the mount phase, even one more activity like data binding will happen, style binding will happen, class binding will happen, class binding will happen, and the event binding also happens. That is what additional thing happened. Data binding, style binding, class binding, all these things will happen in which phase? Mount. That means you have some data in a variable. That data comes and display in the UI. You have some styles. That styles will come and apply to the UI. You have some classes. The classes will apply in the UI. All the data binding, style binding, class binding, everything happens in which phase? Mount. Mount phase. In interviews, they may ask like that. In which phase of component cycle the data binding works? Or the class binding works, all the style binding on. But this is not for fresher experience, because for fresher asking all this is too much. That means it is very in-depth to ask. Not required, but it is good for an experienced person to know all this, right? Now, what happens in the update phase? What happens in the update phase? Update phase actually, so change event fires up. Change event fires up, because on update phase only two-way binding will work, and two-way binding is managed by whom? Only one event can manage two-way binding now. What is that event? On change. Can you manage two-way binding on other events? No, we already saw that it can be managed only by using change. Change event fires up for two-way binding. Two-way binding. Not only that, all other events, all actions, all events fire up. All events fire up. That means actions are executed. Results are computed. results are computed. Actions are executed, results are computed. That means any formula, expression, any equation, any calculation you are doing, any results you are computing, everything is performed in this phase. That means the change event fires up, the change event will fires up, the other events will fire up, actions are executed, results are computed, and finally, whatever result comes, that result is rendered. After update, again, which action will perform? After update, another one is render. Two times render will happen. After mount, it will render. After update, it will render. Update means after any changes, it will render. After update is completed, that means one final phase is the last phase, and the last phase is unmount phase. Unmount phase. This is the last phase. That is the unmount phase. After update, and sometimes even without update also, automatically the component unmounts. Tell me when a component will unmount. Already we discussed. When a component will unmount, tell me, when you are changing from one component to another. Already I showed you that in the hooks. We discussed about that. That means what is unmount phase? Unmount phase means, so it fires up when user is changing from one component to another. It fires up when user is changing from one component to another. That is the unmount phase. Okay. Tell me what else will happen in unmount phase. In unmount phase, what happens is events are unsubscribed. Events are unsubscribed. Events are subscribed in which phase? Mount phase. They are unsubscribed. That means disconnect. Once unmount happens, events will not fire up anymore. Accidentally also they don't fire up because they are disconnected. That means events are unsubscribed. After events are unsubscribed, so state is disposed. Whatever state allocated for memory is disposed. State is disposed. That is the reason the state of one component is not accessible to another. Because the state allocated for a component, it is disposed. Another point is context. Context is disposed. Whatever the context memory allocated, it is destroyed. Remember, you are moving from one component to another. If you are in the same component and there is another component coming inside, that means your component is not changing. Another component is coming inside, then the context is still available. Context means the memory of parent is shared to the child. But when you are moving from one component to another component, state is destroyed, another context also destroyed. Is context memory accessible to component which is outside context scope? Not. That's already we discussed in the hooks concept. So context is disposed, and the component memory is disposed. Whatever memory allocated for the component memory means in that memory, there may be some several third party libraries loaded, because in a component also you will link third parties like Axios, like Formic, those all will be disposed. These all actions happen in which phase? Unmount. And actually, this unmount is managed by the methods. What are the methods that manage unmount? So that is the methods are, we have the methods component will unmount. So component did unmount. These are the methods which are going to handle the unmount phase. They are going to manage the unmount phase. These methods will handle the unmount. This is the unmount. That means, remember, this unmount may happen anytime. Anytime means after mounting, it may unmount. After updating, it may unmount. After anything, it may happen, right? So this is the basic phase of the components. This is the basic phase of components. So in the component, what is a component life cycle hooks? Component life cycle hooks are the methods which are managed with different activities to perform from a component start to component end. So these are not related to any state allocation, means these are not state hooks, these are not mount hooks. Actually, these are all ready-made methods, inbuilt methods. Inbuilt methods. That is the reason, because of these all present in a class component, we don't need hooks here. Why we don't need hooks? Because already they are present. State is configured, context is configured, the memory is managed. That is the reason we don't need explicit. Everything internally managed. But this is very heavy. Why it is very heavy? I don't want the properties. I don't want the state. I don't want the mount actions to perform in certain components, but they will be working. Then obviously it is heavy. You don't need them, but internally they have. That means why you are having them if you don't need them? What is advantage of function component? You can add only what you need. For that situation, what you need, only that you can add. But in class, everything is available. Even you don't use it, it is available. Even you don't use it, it is still available. Then it is heavy for application. That's the reason modern React communities will never recommend of classes. Right? So because functions will make asynchronous, modular. Modular means only what is needed for the situation will be used. But these are very heavy. But remember, officially, this is another one diagram. I will explain here. This is request flow 3. That is the request flow 3. Now, important is when you look at the official diagram, that means actually the component life cycle here, React component life cycle here. When you look at the official life cycle hooks here, so this is the official architectural diagram. In React website also, the official diagram is this. In official React website or anywhere you search for React component lifecycle, you will get this diagram. But you will not see what is present inside. You will not see what is present inside. Right? That means what actions are present inside, how they work inside, you will never see. Means I showed you that every phase have several activities to do. When events are registered, when events are binded, everything I have shown. Even in official website of React also, you will find only this diagram as a component life cycle. That is the reason for experienced people who have seen these technologies evolving. That means, remember, you are learning React library. Do you know we at our times we learned how to build these libraries? You, after all learning these libraries, we learned how to build these libraries because we built several JavaScript based libraries before React and Angular to handle different types of interactions. That means very senior experts in software development, they know how to build these libraries. That means you have seen Angular or React, but we have seen how they are built, because we in our generation of web development, we are responsible for designing all this. because we don't have ready-made like this. Now you have ready-made like this, then you are using it. That is the reason experienced people know what happens in every phase internally because they have built it. Even today, you can build it. You can learn how to build a component by yourself manually, but that is time waste. In the modern generation, we don't need that. Do you know in old generation of web development, we build components, we write events, we design phases for every component manually. From your generation, you are learning how to use components. Our generation have seen how to design them. That is the reason senior experts in web development, they know the entire internal happening of a phase because they built it, they written it. We know how to write it also. Then that is the reason it is an open source community. If you go to the GitHub of React, there you will find React developers repositories. In those repositories, you will find how to build all these libraries. But that is very risky for you. You can't understand much until or unless you are experienced. So, but the point here is this is just only the flow that you will understand in React library. But internally, lot of things will happen. Those all are not required until or unless you are experienced. Because anybody shows 5-7 years experience in React. For such people, we ask those questions. What are the activities in mount phase? What are the activities when events will subscribe, when event will unsubscribe, when the two-way binding will work, class binding works, which phases will manage such things. But for fresher, these three phases are enough. First phase is mount. But you know, before mount, there is one more phase. What is that? Constructor. But see in the diagram, in the mounting, they have shown constructor. How? That is the wrong one. And this is an official architecture diagram. It is official diagram in their website. And even you practically know that mount happens after constructor only. You have seen the error when you try to create. Then this doesn't look satisfying. That means you are saying that a component is created. A component is created after mounting. How that can happen? That means it's okay. That is the reason one of the drawback of React is it's poor documenting. Poor documenting means somebody like you designed this document. Then how you can trust them? Everything is not correct. Some problems are there, but it's not a big issue. We just follow because we know the internal process how it works. But this is officially not great correct. Why? Because without a constructing of an component, it cannot mount. Already you saw the error. What it says, without mount, how you are writing. In the mount only you can define. We cannot do anything in the constructor, right? Anyhow, these are the options. After mount, it will render. After update, it will render. And finally, which one will happen? Unmount. Unmount will happen. This is the basic architecture. And remember, class components and this architecture infrastructure is completely not for the modern generation of React. But for interviews reason, I have to explain this. Why? Because in interviews, still in companies, they ask questions on this. But in modern React, we never recommend to use classes. Only we have to use functions. And functions don't have any phases. Functions don't have all these phases. Everything is explicitly added into the function. Function have, it doesn't have even a mount phase also. We will add a mount into that function, right? This is basic point how the component lifecycle works. Now, once you know this, now we are going to learn about how to use third-party components. Third-party components means all these days we designed component. But in real-time projects, ready-made components will be there. We have to implement and use. So in this, you are going to learn MUI. That is what actually call as material UI. So material UI. This is a component library for that. That means you want some barcode, you are some QR code, you want some captcha, you want some nav bar, you want some pop-ups. All these are readily available in a third party libraries. We can just import them and we can use them. So React development becomes easy and fast with the help of these components. We will see how to use them in next session. Tomorrow we will do. In tomorrow's session, we will learn how to use this MUI. Okay, right. All these diagrams I will upload into the classroom. You can check that. Okay, right.